The paper that I'm going to do today might seem on first glance to be very much the opposite of all that, in the sense that rather than being about connection and sociability or warmth, it's about nightlife and places known for nightlife as being over. So my title, Everywhere is Over, refers to what is now a very familiar narrative of decline and loss, which we regularly see in the British press and in news stories in the UK about areas, typically in London, that are very strongly associated with nightlife, like Soho or Camden or Shoreditch, which are three kind of main nightlife precincts in London, and how these places are basically being threatened or are over. So in these newspaper articles, it's not just about these neighborhoods, though, but about nightlife in general that is thought of as being in decline, has been lost, is under threat, or now exists largely elsewhere, the distant past or a distant place. So what I want to think about today then is just these general questions about what these newspaper articles, what these statements might mean. What does it mean to lose nightlife? Whose nightlife has been lost? Where has it gone? Can we get it back? So my argument today, my broad conjecture today is that these statements about nightlife as finished and places as being over is really about a whole range of different anxieties and a whole range of different things. It's about changes in musical taste. It's, of course, about economic changes, but it's also about creating and producing an historical narrative of place. It's about belonging, it's about comfort, and it's about relations between people and place and time. So if I could just have the next slide. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to work really through two main arguments today. There's a bit of a long introduction coming, but then there's two main arguments. The first is that I'm going to be looking at some of these arguments and these articles about nightlife and decline, particularly in reference to work from Deacon and Thurnell Reed, and also a really great PhD thesis by Ben Asseter. I hope I pronounced that correctly, which I discovered after sending in my abstract. I had one of those things where I sent in this abstract and then did more research and found a journal article and a whole PhD on this topic and had that, but I think I'm actually discussing slightly different things. I'm then going to end very, very briefly by talking about nostalgia. All right, so this is a speculative paper. It's ongoing research, but I'm going to argue to raise some themes which I think are pertinent to the conference. And I'm going to look at these claims that nightlife is over and that shouldn't be dismissed out of hand, but perhaps we can employ a much more positive spin on what these articles are saying and claiming. So, the title of this year's conference is Global Night, Past, Present, and Future. And I think this title raises for us all sorts of really interesting challenges over the next couple of days. What is meant by the global? Who's global? How does the global relate to what many of us are discussing in terms of connections to the local, about the circulation of music and cultural forms, about mobility, about blockages as well, as I know Maria is talking about as well, and Ben Tausig has talked about those mobilities and indeed those economic blockages as well that happen between the local and the global in the circulation of culture. So I'm also really interested in this title, Global Night, Past, Present, and Future, in the way that it challenges us to consider the night very much in that four-dimensional way of past, present, and future. How are we thinking about time here? Are we thinking conjuncturally and all times at once? What sort of nostalgic or utopic imaginings continue to feed into how we understand nightlife? And these are perhaps questions we'll be talking about a lot over the next couple of days. And finally, very much mirroring Emmanuel's introduction, I think there's a really important question, which I'll discuss a little bit towards the end about methodology and methods. And how do we consider and how do we locate the sort of really rich emotional landscape of the night across past, present, and future? How do we do that research? How do we center the sort of fleetingness of culture? Nightlife, as it is very broadly understood, of course, is very fleeting and changeable. So, what do we hang on to analyze? What sort of tools do we need? So, just as a little bit of background, many of the questions about this relationship between the past and the present, about relations of proximity between people and places, between the local and the global, have been of interest to me since my PhD, which was around, I did it at the University of Sydney around the millennium. And it was about heritage and themed parks. And I was looking at a lot of the work around, like Michael Jay's work around non-place, and trying to think about that in a much more effective way. More recently, though, in the introduction to Exploring Nightlife, which Geordie Noffrey and I edited, Geordie is here, in 2018, we also looked at the kind of dominant idea that was already circulating then, that nightlife and the night more generally was at risk of being lost. And we touched on this theme of loss, and we looked at how, in the introduction in the book, we looked at around, that there were concerns about the loss of the night sky, for example, due to light pollution. Lots of debates about gentrification, the loss of place identity. That's a very dominant theme. And we looked as well as that kind of possible loss of that distinction between night and day, or how that line, or maybe that frontier, as Melbourne has characterized it, is lived and understood and configured. And what we said, though, is that that anxiety is actually quite old, and we've traced it back to at least World War II. In Europe, where there were similar anxieties about the loss of nightlife, and nightlife understood in quite narrow terms of going out. Um, in Exploring Nightlife as well, the afterword was written by Will Straw, who pointed out in the afterword that that there is indeed this dominant narrative of decline of nightlife, but that certainly didn't translate into all nightlife. And he talks about white night art events, for example, as others have talked about the expansion of VIP members bars that have happened across London, or in research conducted with Marion Roberts and I here, looking at the various pub and venue extensions that we found happening across Westminster. So many of the chapters in that anthology, though, documented that there were definitely changes happening. But I think that anthology was more about the increasing management and narrowing of a very specific understanding and form and definition of nightlife rather than necessarily decline. Can I have the next slide? Great. So the COVID lockdowns, though, very much inspired then another whole kind of wave, if you like, of articles about London's nightlife as being over, or areas associated with nightlife like Camden or Shoreditch, or even London as a whole place as being kind of finished. Now, can I have the next slide again, actually? Sorry, I delayed. That you might recall, though, that this sort of debate about places as being over, it was kind of lampooned in an episode of Sex and the City a while ago, but it's also been taken up in a number of other forums as well. During the COVID lockdowns, you might recall there was a particularly heated debate also played out in the New York Times after it was claimed that all of New York was over. And we'd already become quite familiar with a number of other articles about whether it's Brooklyn or Kreuzberg, but also being over. But COVID really seemed to accentuate all that as well. Jerry Seinfeld got involved in this. It all played out in social media. And there were lots of claims that circulated about the decline of cities and creativity, about affordability, about commercialization, and about general anti-urbanism sometimes, and a general sense that maybe everywhere was really over. So I just want to start by clarifying here that I think a lot of what these news stories are alerting us to are really quite genuine concerns of the heart, and I'll come back to this after. They are about the fact that many cities, of course, have become very unaffordable, and venues are closing, some of which are really important to us, our networks, our sense of self. Indeed, if we limit our understanding of nightlife to bars, clubs, and pubs in certain areas, there is, of course, ample evidence about places closing. The Nighttime Industries Association, which is a British industry rep group, they recently reported yet another report in this on April about the number of particularly late night venues which have closed in London and across the UK in recent years. So in these stories, again, what's really centered is displacement, gentrification, tourism often, neoliberalism tends to get used as kind of very broad, vague term, as a very much part of this discourse. So today, then, I'm not really questioning some of these, what I think are really genuine concerns. In fact, I'm going to try and make sense of some of these concerns and what they might mean. And I think we mustn't overlook, though, the ways that specific nightlife spaces, and particularly certain nightlife areas, are very, very heavily policed and are subject to closure for reasons relating to noise or licensing, but also how certain areas are also, of course, highly racialized and classed, and how that also affects what remains open and what's closing as well. But what I'm thinking about today, though, isn't necessarily the causes and the drivers. I think there's plenty of other work on that. What I'm interested more in is, what do these articles say? Why now? What is it about nightlife that seems to attract these articles? So I'm not going to answer why venues are closing where or precise numbers, but it's really about this dominant discourse of decline and how it motivates and supports other concerns and about other socio-spatial changes as well. Could I have the next slide? Hmm. Great. So, a recent paper by Robert Deacon and Thomas Thurnell Read is a really useful guide here, and I'm sure some of you will be familiar with Thurnell Read's work on intimacy and pubs, and with Robert Deacon has recently written about the narrative of decline in relation to British pubs. So this is also a very familiar story in the United Kingdom about threats and closures of the local pub. They recently published a paper about this in April this year. And again, it looks at the ways that the closure of pubs is often understood as driven by economic changes and economic conditions, but how that gets taken up as a cultural issue. All right, so the pub, as they argue, is very, very much within this discourse, is understood really as a national institution and a British way of life that becomes under threat. So the articles about the decline of the British pub actually identify quite different causes to my own. They often focus on the smoking ban in inside licensed venues. They often look at cheap alcohol, the cost of living crisis, and duty on alcohol, making it cheaper to drink at home. But these are then extrapolated into much broader kind of ideas about community and place and the loss of community. What their research has also found in their analysis of newspaper articles about the decline of the British pub is that while it's very much broadly understood as largely working class pubs or country pubs which are closing, instead we see this discourse of a kind of great British pub that becomes very universalizing. And in fact, the pub, even though we know is very much associated with various forms of exclusion, becomes instead understood as a very much a cross-cultural space for all of Britain. So in the news reports that they look at, it's not just working class pubs that are under threat. So Instead, there's this discourse of Britishness as a whole, which very much creates this imagined community via, Benedict Anderson. So what gets centered is this in this analysis is that the decline and closure of British pubs is this very clear kind of slippage between the British pub and community, inclusivity, the fabric of the community, the nation. So there's lots of really, really affective slippages and associations that are happening here between notions of loss and imagined community and creating a sense of solidarity. So, in the newspaper articles that I've been collecting since at least COVID and doing some early analysis into, the stories are, of course, slightly different. They're about not just the British pub, but about Berlin, they're about London, they're about New York, they're about Sydney. That all these endless articles and how that they typically sit alongside or are supported by a more general discussion about the decline of clubbing or the decline of certain areas. Certain areas like Shoreditch get called Snoreditch, that kind of thing. So when I first started collecting these data, I found, to be honest with you, most of these articles I found just really, really irritating. And indeed, I think there is something kind of dismissive and quite cynical about this idea of proclaiming an area as being over. It's in part about taste and distinction. It's about taking on the voice of someone to proclaim what is in or out. But I think it also represents a way of thinking of place almost like a commodity. And perhaps this shouldn't surprise us. Perhaps it's not a surprise that London is understood now like skinny jeans or matcha tea or bubble tea and something that's very last year. But I think once again, these articles, like the work on pubs, I think illuminate a lot more for us to think about than simply the dismissal of an area as being out of fashion. I think these articles are quite often about the unaffordability of areas, but there's another interesting line of inquiry to trace here, which is not only about the causes, but about how, again, these stories construct a link between the local and the national, who's local, who's national, about how Britain, or at least one community in Britain, pictures itself. It's about which configurations of culture and history and memory are taking up as mattering and as needing to be defended. Indeed, it's about what community is being imagined, what sort of reader is being interpolated when we talk about an area as being over or indeed as being lost. Sorry, that's my table wobbling. So can I have another slide? So, not long after sending off this abstract, as I said, I discovered another really great PhD had recently come out about the topic by Ben Asseter, who was at Goldsmiths, and I'll have the reference later at the end of my slides. And Asseter's PhD, Night Moves in a Changing City Transformation to the Spaces and Time of London's Electronic Dance Music Culture, is really well worth reading. And it raises a lot of the question I'm also thinking about today of whose community is spoken of, which venues are closing, who is talking. So Asseter's research begins from a very similar question about why this current focus on nightlife as in decline in London. And he argues that there is a very dominant framing of this topic in terms of gentrification, which again, while important, avoids other more detailed questions. Like Deacon and Thurnell Reed, discourses of nightlife and nightlife areas being over arrays other ways of thinking about urban change and the ways that specific economic or social changes happen in different intensities in different neighbourhoods. Soho perhaps can't explain what happens in Sunderland. It ignores the multiple ways that such neighbourhoods or venues were ever experienced in the past anyway, and perhaps ignores the multiple ways that such neighbourhoods may be operated as spaces of exclusion and elevates one particular voice. And again, I'm interested though in what is that voice? What is that voice saying? Who's it speaking to? And who's it speaking of? So Asseter traces that concern about nightlife and decline back to 2010. And what he argues, though, is that whilst newspapers like The Guardian back then listed a whole kind of quite broad range of different drivers for club closures and the decline of nightlife, as did Vice magazine, very quickly, though, that they were sort of ignored and there became just this one single dominant story of gentrification as an explanatory framework. Now, quite interestingly, this was actually challenged, though, by research produced by the National Endowment for Society, Technology and the Arts in 2017, who painted quite a complex picture and said actually gentrification can't really explain why not all the venues are closing. There is quite a lot else that's going on. The drivers of change that Asseter looks at in a very kind of locally specific way looks at the intersection of the economic, but also legal, social, cultural factors in how music and club cultures as well, really importantly, don't just sort of abruptly end, but also reassemble and develop and move around in quite complex ways. Um, but what's very interesting about Asseter's thesis is that he looks at very much the day-to-day maintenance of nightlife scenes and again how they reassemble and reform in different areas. And he argues and asks, when considering the perceived decline of nightlife or dance music culture, which genres, scenes, and spaces are we referring to? What value judgments are involved in these definitions, and what communities are included and excluded from histories of culture? So I think, in short, this is a question which is really pertinent for today and tomorrow in terms of our conference when we're thinking about history, when we're thinking about the local and the global. What is it that these narratives seek to affirm? What histories are constructed out of nightlife, and what are those histories doing? So, unlike the stories of pubs declining, which feature publicans, I think what's interesting about many of the articles I looked at in like the Evening Standard and Time Out, Guardian, City AM, The Independent, BBC, as you can see, if we could have the next slide. There's a whole sort of range of these articles. There is this kind of an insider recognition here. They often center the voices of DJs and artists and people in the clubbing and creative sector. So in some ways, it is about Bourdieu's notion of taste, as Sarah Thornton has famously said, club cultures are taste cultures. And as we know, dance culture in particular in the 1980s was understood according to that quite familiar story about cultural commodification. But there is a really important story as well to be told here, of course, as well about the cycle of music and dance culture and nightlife more generally. So Deacon and Thurnell Reed identify in their own work then on the closure of British pubs that there's a movement between the local and the national. As I said, the local pub becomes a representation of the nation, and a threat to the village pub becomes a threat to the fabric of the country. I think interestingly, the decline of places like Soho or Camden similarly moved between the kind of local areas and what they represent in the national imaginary. But they become quite associated with slightly different discourses around fashion, creativity, alternative culture. But I think this is what's really interesting here is that what's really notable about these is that there's actually never one specific place or even one specific time frame that's referred to. So the articles that I've looked at about the loss of nightlife in Soho, for instance, refer to actually a whole entire range of different times and different places and different cultures that the peak. Some people say, oh, it was better in the 90s, it was better in the 20s, it was better in the 2000s. that there is this whole sort of range of locating the time and the place right up until from the 1980s onwards. There's an interesting film recently released called Last Night in Soho, which very much reactivated that still, I think, really important 1960s kind of swinging London narrative as well. Why does this matter? Does it matter about that kind of movement of time and place? Well, I think it does. Like the British pub research by Deacon and Thurnell Reed, the nightlife are over stories are in some ways not necessarily about a specific place, or in my case, even a specific time, but they're really just a more general sense of decline, anchored by a fairly general sense of gentrification, of licensing, of too many rules, of people not going out. It's this general sense, it's a structure of feeling that everywhere is over and that these places almost become like a kind of non-place as well, that have no history in a way, or no history anymore. So to we're going for what about 20, I think about 25 minutes. So yeah, I'll just wrap this up in about the next 10 minutes then. So, my broad kind of claim today, and like I said, this is ongoing, and I'm interested in your comments and thinking about this over the next couple of days. But my broad conjecture today is that statements along the line of somewhere being over reveal a really great deal about the way that the past and the present of nightlife is imagined, about which communities speak for an area, and about how economic changes are understood in cultural terms, and about how these laments are about more than just a specific place and time. In the UK, I think they're actually a way of making legible changes in time and place via the example of nightlife. We'll come back to this in just a moment. I think that sense of loss as well can be characterized in some ways as nostalgic. And indeed, the sources I've been using today will often use that term. So I'm going to turn then to nostalgia and just some early thoughts on this in the final part of the paper. Before I do that, just a point I raised earlier about how the methods and the methodology we need. Megan Morris, the great cultural studies theorist, in her book Too Soon, Too Late, asked that all-important question of how do theorists of culture understand history? What do we make of history when the historical artifacts that we examine so quickly change? How do we understand the historical significance or the significance of a fleeting summer song or the rapid configurations of nightlife that twist and turn? Returning to Asseter just briefly, he argues that nostalgia is indeed very much part of the music scene, is already part of that. And he argues that dance music cycles of nostalgia have given rise to various intergenerational conflicts mediated by practices typically of subcultural distinction. This raises questions like who was there first? Who did it better? Who has the right to claim ownership over a scene or a genre? So I think there is already very much an ongoing conversation there, albeit one that, as suggested here, though, shouldn't be bogged down in questions of authenticity or originality. How else might we make sense of the refrain of nightlife as existing in a better past, as the fun being elsewhere? And again, I wonder if nostalgia can help us out here. Can I have the next slide, please? So nostalgia might seem an odd place to end on, given that nostalgia typically has a very, very bad reputation. As Jacobson argues, it's earned itself a very bad name. It's something surrounded by the stagnant and the musky smell of the past and of that which has been left behind on the road forward. So it's not typically associated with the glittering new, the talk of the town, or the most prized possessions in a modern society. It does not stand for or denote progress, advancement, or future orientation. It's rather shrouded in the mist of the past and is backward looking to what has been, but is no more. And I think this is a really interesting quote again for thinking about nightlife and the way that nightlife again is, what sort of utopics or what sort of nostalgia sort of operates through that. I was going to talk about Mark Fisher's work and presentism, but maybe if I publish this, I'll address all that there. But I think that thinking about nightlife and the night in terms of that kind of tension between the glittering new, the talk of the town, and also then the kind of nostalgic is a really interesting line to follow. There is a very well-developed body of literature, of course, that considers nostalgia as always reactive, as simply a kind of response to social change. So, for example, a recent book, Anglo-Nostalgia, The Politics of Emotion in a Fractured West by Campanella and Dassou, very much represents this. It explains nostalgia in terms of Donald Trump and Brexit and those other social movements. That this is an understanding of nostalgia that owes, at least in terms of its popularity, to, of course, Alvin Toffler's work on future shock. That this idea that nostalgia is basically a response to an activation, if you like, of kind of discomfort with the present. So modernity, of course, and nostalgia are often thought alongside each other. Um, but nostalgia is of course far more ambiguous than this. To refer to someone or something as nostalgic is also very dismissive. It's also very dismissive of their concerns. So we could argue that the nightlife is over mantra could very much accord with this sense of nostalgia as being a response to change, especially economic and social changes. And indeed, in this model, nostalgia is perhaps a very selective remembering of a place. It's a form of place attachment, which creates a singular sense of what a place is, or what it is, or what it could be. It's basically a distortion, if you like, that maybe Soho was never like that, or Camden was never like that. I think, though, that that doesn't really give us much to work with in thinking about the history of place and the kind of effective relations we have to nightlife in the past. Um, Nostalgia has a bad reputation as an inability to think about the present, and is quite often then thought of in those terms as simply doing bad history. But I think instead we can see these laments as not just really about history, but actually the construction of history, the construction of memory and feelings that link us to other ways of doing and understanding and making sense of social change, other than just the economic, for example. It's a way, a different register, if you like, of connecting with the past. If we read these stories as a testament to the construction of memory via nightlife, other questions start to open. What has been constructed here? It's not just about bad history. It's about what sort of history is being made. Who's making this history? I think, as Harper has explained as well, if I could have the next slide. Back in, of course, 1996, through nostalgia. So if we think about nostalgia and what is it doing, we through nostalgia, through that emotion, we know not only what we hold most dear, but the quality of experiencing that we deny ourselves habitually. So what do we do with this? Again, I want to avoid thinking about these newspaper articles um, the way that they do kind of in some ways kind of fix a place, but in kind of in some ways they don't fix a place. As I've said, I think they're very slippery, that the times and the places they refer to crisscross across time, as both in terms of they're both nostalgic and utopic in various ways. So nostalgia becomes kind of really wildly ambiguous in these stories as they send us off in different directions to the past and to the future. So there is problems here. I mean, of course, lamenting a place's nightlife misses a lot of the complexity of all of urban change. It fixes the meaning of a place. So, if we were to draw on Doreen Massey, it's a way of understanding place that, of course, erases wider entanglements of how the meanings of places are contested. It's for this reason that nostalgia is often dismissed. But I think there is a lot more, again, that's going on here and a lot of other questions to ask. Why these articles? What longings are being activated? What rememberings are happening here? What are the politics then of remembering nightlife? What does it mean to reassemble nightlife and to produce an archive of nightlife? This is a question that we have in the UK now, as the first museum of youth culture is opening later this year. And again, the questions there of whose memories and whose nightlife and how does that get featured? What other cultural formations are formed there as well in terms of its links with fashion and other cultures? So I think this is also really about the struggle of London's nightlife and British nightlife is also not just one of place then, but really one of memory. And I think what's positive here is that we can read into this familiar refrain of lost London nightlife as evidence of just the incredible importance that nightlife has taken on in the British national imaginary, that the loss of a club is not just a club or a space to hang out, but it also activates a number of stories about how we explain what's happening in the UK around youth, around the past and the present. So the importance of nightlife is such that nightlife spaces have now become an identifiable way of explaining and connecting to social changes. We do need to be wary, I think, as I said, of trying to too neatly string together place, history, and identity, though. So to say that Soho is over does, again, sort of fixes place. But again, I think we also need to ask why is this happening? What sort of stories are being made here? So to bring it towards an end, then I'll just come towards the end. Then I think that there are various serious problems. So just to say, I think that the articles then about the decline of British nightlife are very important, and I think they're really worthy of analysis because, in many respects, they're constructing a history, but they're also cultivating a certain way of understanding nightlife that is historicized. And that I think is quite interesting as well, that it's understanding nightlife in a very kind of historical framework. There are very serious problems blighting the UK right now, and the often made claim about Shoreditch or Soho, I think, does refer to the very real consequences of our ridiculous cost of living crisis that we're having. But I think as well that these familiar refrains also illustrate the deeply effective ways that nightlife continues to connect us to the past and indeed the global. Indeed, music and culture is of course integral to the stories we tell ourselves about places past and future. As suggested by Pickering and Kitely, citing Connell and Gibson, we can think particularly here of migrant music. And migrant music epitomizes both dream and nostalgia. And the example that they use is Portuguese fado, which they characterize as a sorrow that was almost hope. That's a nice thing to think about. But it's a useful account of nostalgia as a very ambiguous emotion that rather than being only about a place as being over, also challenges us then, as we're doing over the next couple of days, to think about history, about whose history, about how to understand history, and about what becomes activated then within the present through the research that we do. Thank you very much for listening.